Good morning, everyone. My name is Priscilla Rader. I'm the Education Coordinator for the Animal Legal Defense Fund, and I have the great honor of moderating our first plenary session of the Animal Law Conference, Understanding Our Clients, Philosophy, Ethology, and the Law. With me are three esteemed scholars in their fields of moral philosophy, scientific biology, and the law. Dr. Ramona Ilea is a professor of philosophy and is both the chair of the philosophy department and the chair of the environmental studies, policy, culture, and society program at Pacific University. She is the recipient of the Pacific University's President Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching. Dr. Ilea finished her PhD at the University of Minnesota in 2006 with a dissertation titled Moral Philosophy and Social Change. Since then, her work has been published in many journals, books, and articles, including the Journal of Agriculture and Environmental Ethics, as well as Beyond Species. Together with Susan Hawthorne and Monica Jansen, she is the founder and owner of Engaged Philosophy, a resource to help those interested in intersection between civic engagement and philosophy. Becca is a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Studies at New York University, where she studies issues related to the animal protection, specializing in well-being for aquatic animals. With a doctoral degree in psychology from Columbia University and a Killam postdoctorate research fellowship in animal welfare from the University of British Columbia. Professor Frank's work bridges diverse fields with the goal of further strengthening animal protection legislation and public support behind that protection. She recently published Positive Welfare for Fishes, Rationale and Areas for Future Study, a peer-reviewed article she co-authored with her animal studies master's student, Isabel Fifth-Cook, arguing for the need to include fish in consideration in positive welfare, and I could not agree more. Angela Fernandez is an associate professor at the Faculty of Law, University of Toronto, cross-appointed with the Department of History at the University of Toronto. Professor Fernandez has recently published a book-length study on the famous first possession property case, Pearson v. Post, In the Hunt for the Fox, Law and Professionalization in American Legal Culture. She is an associate editor of the Law and History Review, a fellow with the Oxford Center for Animal Law Ethics, and a member of the Board of Advisors for Animal Justice Canada. And last year, I just have to make a point, the Animal Legal Defense Fund changed their logo to a fox, and his name is Raynard, and that is the name of the fox in Pearson v. Post. And we want to have him claim ownership of his own body integrity and his life, and so he's taking back that. So very, very excited to see that you were examining that case. So we'll first hear from Ramona, then Becca, and then Angela. Please join me in welcoming Ramona.
Thank you, Priscilla, for that awesome introduction, and thank you, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. I've been at this conference about 10 years ago, and actually I was like stranded in the rain waiting for a ride or something, and nothing happened, and Joyce actually gave me a ride, and she saw me looking all sad and said, "Do you need a ride? Are you okay?" And I was like, "I'm so cold." And she was like, "Let me drive you to the MAX station or something." And I was like, "I don't know who you are, but you're amazing." And then since then, I've been following her work for many reasons, but also for that little personal connection. And this is an amazing conference. I've been to about 65 conferences in the last 10 years, and this is one of my favorites. I think the speakers are amazing. The food is amazing. The participants are like excited and actually like listening and all that. So thank you for inviting me, and thanks for coming here. So I'm a philosopher. I do ethics. I teach a variety of ethics classes, including a one-semester-long animal ethics class, which is a super exciting class, and I'm privileged to do that. And we talk a lot about moral status of animals. And some people think that talking about animals, especially about being vegetarian or vegan, is like a new trend, like something that we do nowadays because we're bored or something, or because we're privileged, or because whatever. And this couldn't be further from the truth. Philosophers, kind of when they hear that, we're like, what? How could you think that? Philosophers have been talking about animal ethics for over 2,500 years. So I'm going to start with that by asking you first if you could put up your hand if you have ever heard of Pythagoras. Pythagoras? Awesome. It looks like you all took high school math or something like that. And I bet if I asked you to put up your hand again, if you think Pythagoras was a mathematician, you would all put up your hand again, but I know you're tired and it's early in the morning. I don't want to have you but most people think Pythagoras was a mathematician that did the Pythagorean theorem about, and Pythagoras was a mathematician, but he was also a philosopher, and we often think of him as the first philosopher. So I'm going to start by talking about him because he was vegetarian. So if you think it's hard to be vegetarian today in 2019, think about how hard it must have been 2,500 years ago. There were no Beyond Burgers. There was no Daiya cheese and cheesecakes and things like that. So Pythagoras was not only vegetarian, but he wrote about animals and the moral status of animals. And he argued that animals deserve moral consideration. And because they deserve moral consideration, it would be morally wrong to kill them, to torture them, to eat them, and so on. His ideas were maybe a little bit unusual in the sense that he believed in reincarnation. So he thought that if you're eating a steak, reincarnation, he thought that humans could be reincarnated as animals. So he thought if you're eating a steak, you might be eating your dead grandmother. And he thought that would be really weird to cut up your grandmother into little pieces and put pepper and salt on her and so on. Like you don't want to do that, right? And then he also thought, and this is a more kind of idea that hopefully will resonate with you, that animals are our kins, right? We're similar to them. And we're similar enough that it's weird to eat your kin, right? So even if there is no reincarnation, they're similar enough that we should treat them as beings worthy of respect. Not only was Pythagoras vegetarian, but his ideas were so influential that there were lots of people following him around, and they called themselves Pythagoreans. And they were vegetarian, right? So one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this, because I see my role here as kind of one of the first speakers of the conference, and kind of setting the stage a little bit and having us think about the moral status of animals and seeing where our ideas about animals came from. But you might think, well, I didn't even know that Pythagoras thought this. What role did Pythagoras play in the history of the world? Well, some, not too much. Unfortunately, Aristotle, who you might have heard of as well, played a bigger role. And I don't know if you guys know this painting. It's in a lot of dentist offices and even legal offices because it kind of makes people look intellectual because it's called the School of Athens, and it portrays all the ancient philosophers. So Pythagoras is right there in the corner reading a book. I don't know if you can see him, but he's in the corner reading a book. Not that important, right? He's scholarly and geeky and cool and smart, but he's not the center stage, right? So who's in the center? Socrates and Aristotle, or Plato and Aristotle, depending on how you want to interpret things. So Aristotle is the main guy, right? And Aristotle thought that there are natural hierarchies, right? Naturally, men are superior to women, he said. Naturally, humans are superior to animals, and so on. When you look at these ideas, right, you can kind of see that maybe that's where Western civilization that's who they followed, right? So unfortunately, those were the ideas that had a bigger impact than Pythagoras. However, Pythagoras had his followers, minority, but still, and until the 19th century, the word Pythagorean meant vegetarian. So if sometimes you hear people say vegetarianism is a new concept. The word didn't even exist. Well, the word might not have existed, but the concept has existed for over 2,500 years. And there were whole groups of people that bonded with each other and talked about moral status of animals and so on. And I'm going to skip a few hundred years, and I'm going to take a sip of water. So I'm still projecting my voice, even though I have a microwave. I don't have a microwave. I have a microphone. I think I'm hungry. I'm like thinking about food. I'm used to teaching and projecting my voice, so let me drink some water here. So we're going to skip a few hundred years, just because I have 20 minutes, not a whole semester, and talk about a few other philosophers that have shaped our ideas about animals. Descartes, who's another really, really well-known philosopher, many people refer to him as a genius, had, unfortunately, a really huge influential role. He argued that animals are like machines. So if you think about machines, well, machines don't have feelings, right? They can act correctly. They can slow down and misbehave in a way, right? So he compared them to those watches. Do you know those watches that had to be turned, right? Like your grandma might have had one. I had one because I'm old and, when I was little. And if I didn't turn it, it would slow down. Like it would be 5 minutes behind, 10 minutes behind, and so on. And then eventually, if I didn't turn it long enough, it would just die. And he said animals are just like that. If you don't feed them, if you don't give them water, they might look sluggish, and then they might die. But that doesn't show that they have feelings. They're not suffering if you're not feeding them or if you're not giving them water. They're just like machines. And if you think about modern machines like computers or cell phones or like your MacBook making that little sound, right? When you open it, it's not happy to see you. It's just a MacBook. It just does that, right? So he's like, yeah, animals make sounds, they do things, they move around, but they don't feel anything. So he thought we were being overly sentimental in treating animals as if they have feelings. And he said, you can do dissection without anesthesia, and there are pictures of like dogs strapped to tables being dissected without anesthesia because people were like, let's not be sentimental about this, right? So again, Descartes had a big influence. So you might think, gosh, philosophers were jerks, but it's just the big ones were not that friendly to animals. But there were others, again, like maybe more of minority, but they also played a very important role, that responded to Descartes and said, you're wrong. Here are some arguments to think that animals do have feelings. They deserve moral consideration. They deserve respect, and so on. So if this was a semester-long class, we would be talking about all of these in detail and reading them and so on. But John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham, there were utilitarians that advocated for the rights of women, for animals deserving moral consideration. And they played a huge, important role in our legal system, actually, in our ideas about the world, and our ethics. And then there were many others, and Gandhi is not usually regarded as a philosopher. I think he kind of is, so I put him on the list. But he was also, the reason I put him on the list is because he cites a bunch of these philosophers, and they cite each other, and it kind of goes back, right? So they're building on each other's work. And then there are lots and lots of contemporary philosophers, and I'll get to that in a second. But right before we get to the modern philosophers, I want to say a little bit more about this idea that animals don't actually have rights, and they don't deserve moral consideration directly. We have indirect duties to them. So I want to talk about this because I think this is actually a really common view today that a lot of people hold. Maybe some of you hold this view, and certainly your friends and relatives and so on hold this view. I bet you anything. So the idea was put forth by Immanuel Kant, German philosopher, extremely influential, and he said, look, when you're hurting animals, what matters are not the animals per se. What matters is that you're hurting humanity and you're hurting your character, right? So you're getting used to cruelty, you're getting desensitized to cruelty, and then you might do bad things towards people. And actually, I took a lift here today because I live in Forest Grove, and my driver was like, what's your talk about? And then he was talking about how his son did some bad thing toward an animal, I don't want to tell you too much, when he was 4 years old, and the parents are horrified, and they're like, oh my gosh, we don't want to raise that kind of son, right? So they like talked to him and monitored him and made sure that he learns that like you should treat animals really well, right? Because you don't want a kid that's torturing animals for fun, right? You want to kind of nip that in the butt, right? Partly because maybe you care about animals, but partly because you don't want to raise that kind of child, right? That's going to develop to think that hurting others is cool, right? So that was Kant's idea, and he actually talked about psychological research that they even had at the time about how psychopaths and sociopaths, develop, start by torturing animals, and then they torture kids, and then women, and then men, and so on. And he thought, he was very animal unfriendly in a way, but in a way very animal friendly, and he even thought that butchers shouldn't have the right to vote because they have been desensitized to cruelty. And also doctors. That's weird, but he listed that too. He was like, they're too used to the blood and the, But he didn't think that animals per se deserved moral consideration because they were not rational and they don't have language. So they're not valuable in themselves. They're valuable for what it tells us about our character and our treatment of humanity. And I think these kinds of arguments come up a lot when you hear arguments about environmental impact of animal agriculture. A lot of times sometimes it's about the animals, but sometimes it's really about humanity, right? And health arguments for vegetarianism, let's say, are often, sometimes they're about the animals, but really they're usually about us, I'm like touching my heart with passion, but about us and our health and our well-being, right? And then it's really just, it's all about us, and the animals are just a way for us to do better or worse, right? You can think about indirect value that animals have, right, to humanity, but you can also think about factory farming and these kinds of conditions as being like, well, this might be bad for humans because of the antibiotics, the hormones, and so on. But it's also bad for the animals, right? So if we look at pictures like this, you might think, this is really bad for the animals, not just for us, right? So battery cages, gestation crates, and so on, debeaking, castrating without anesthesia, and so on, are hurting the animals themselves. And this kind of view is a view that that we have direct duties to animals, and they deserve moral consideration. And they have intrinsic value in themselves. So one of the people that have put this kind of idea forth was Peter Singer. And I hope that you all have heard about him, and if not, go home and like Google him and so on, because he's so influential and so important. So there are not many people in the world that have been credited with starting a social movement. I mean, just try to think, who has started a social movement? Yeah, not a lot of people, right? Peter Singer's credited with starting the modern animal rights movement. I mean, that's a big deal, right? And the book is Animal Liberation, published in 1975. PETA even gave copies of this with their memberships at some point. It's a short little, well, I think short, but maybe not that short, normal little book. And it's so powerful. I have known people that have stopped, that were meat eaters, on a normal American diet, and they read that book in order to prove Peter Singer wrong, because for a debate or something in their class or whatever, and then they actually became vegan overnight and have stayed vegan for the last 20 years. Like, it's that kind of book. And I can say a lot more about that. Don't just read the first chapter and be like, I'm not affected, because I actually think the power of the book is the whole book, not just like one chapter. So Peter Singer published this book in 1975, and it's regarded as the Bible of the animal rights movement, which is interesting because Peter Singer is not religious at all, and he also doesn't believe in rights. So you might think the founder of the animal rights movement must advocate for rights, but he doesn't. He's a utilitarian. So I know some of you know what utilitarianism is, and you're going to be like, don't explain it to us, that's patronizing and so on. And then some of you are going to be like, that's a weird big word, can you say more? So I'm just going to say more about it. And those of you that know about it, just think about your cat and your laundry list and whatever. So the point of utilitarianism is actually very simple, but very, very powerful. The idea is consider everybody's interest equally, those that have interests and that can feel pain and suffering, and try to minimize suffering, right? And create more good. So you can imagine a kind of balance, and you think, well, if I do this, like let's say if I show up to class with some cookies, will that create more happiness or less happiness? What if I show up to class with a bucket of vomit or something? Is that gonna, be an interesting experience, or will that just be gross, right? So sometimes I do think about these things, because sometimes I do like to gross out my students, but I've never done the vomit thing. But I think, should I bring like Oreos, or should I bring these fancy little cookies? Well, the fancy cookies cost more. They don't have, I'm like, and which one? Does anybody have an allergy? Should I bring baby carrots instead? So you can think about all kinds of decisions that you make in your life. Maybe should you go visit your grandma, or should you buy this product or this product? Should you spend your money on this, or should you donate it instead, and so on? And do a little kind of calculation, right? Like, I don't really like flossing and brushing my teeth when I'm really tired, but I think, just do it, Ramona. It's 2 minutes of suffering, right? And it's not huge suffering. Let's be serious. Get over it, right? Floss, because you don't like sitting in that dentist chair, and you don't like paying that kind of money, and you don't like commuting to, the dentist's office. So just do it. And then I do it, right? Because it's not worth, all the suffering that's going to cause if I get a cavity. And I know that from experience. So when you think about animal agriculture in particular, but many of the other practices involving animals, Peter Singer says we can do a quick calculation. How much happiness is there and how much suffering is there, right? So when you think about the happiness, you might think, well, I really do like eating steaks, or I really do like those hot dogs, not just the veggie dogs or whatever. So you get a little bit of happiness, right? But in the context of your life, how important is it to eat steak? I mean, hopefully not that important. Hopefully you guys have friends and family and hobbies and sleep and hot baths and, fruit and all kinds of other things, Netflix, whatever, right? So hopefully there's a lot of other happiness, and you suffer a little bit by not eating the steak, but not that much, right? Meanwhile, how much would this animal suffer, right, when they're subjected to the conditions in factory farms, but even some family farms? Well, they suffer a lot, right? It's a lifetime of suffering, right? So it's a lifetime of suffering versus a little bit of happiness for us. For Singer, this is very important. If you take environmental concerns into account and all the other things, it's just even more clear that we should be vegan or vegetarian. Let me wrap up here by saying just a little bit about Tom Regan, who's the other founder of the animal rights movement and who actually believes in rights per se, not just these calculations. So Regan has some really awesome books. I would really recommend Empty Cages because it's very short, very accessible. You can read it on an airplane, and it talks about all kinds of different things. But Regan thinks that animals have rights, and rights are different. They're just doing a calculation. Rights are kind of like, I used to say trump cards, but I try not to say that anymore because it's weird. It's like, right, you're just like, if that animal's right is being violated, then you should not do it, no matter how much happiness there is, right? So even if your whole life is about steak, right, then you should still not kill the animal in favor of your pleasure, right? So it's a very, again, I'm really simplifying these very complicated philosophical ideas. If you want to know more about this, there are lots of resources online, and there's some in your packets, I think, that they put in. But thank you again for having me at this conference, and it was a pleasure talking to you, and I'll follow up with you more, and the rest of the program looks even more amazing, so thank you.
Okay. Well, I'm so delighted to be here. As was mentioned, my background is in science, and I'm really excited to be able to talk to people in the legal and law areas and learn from you. And so I want to talk today a little bit about how I see the overlap between the work that I do and how we can collaborate together to provide the strongest protections for animals possible. So I'd like to start with a quote from the great moral philosopher Mary Midgley. She writes that scientists influence us by their imagery, by their selection of topics, by the terms in which they explain their theories, by the views that they express about what does and what does not constitute a proper scientific attitude. And so part of her point here is, yes, that science has this great influence on the rest of society for, even people who aren't scientists. It sort of sets the stage and sets the standards. But the real point, I think, that she's trying to make here is that scientists are not value-free. They have imagery, they select topics, they have terms that they use to explain, they have views. And all of those things are values that they themselves are bringing to the table that sets the stage for what can and cannot be done and get done in the science. And therefore, science itself is not value-free. And so with this talk, I want to think about the implications of that insight for animals. So we're here to talk about animal law. I'm coming from a background of science involving animals, and we can think of it as this Venn diagram where there's some things that my colleagues and I do that might not be of interest or relevance to animal law. And then I think there's things, obviously, lots of things in animal law that I would argue science has is no longer useful. And in particular, cases of active physical cruelty to a member of a species within our sphere of moral concern. So I don't think we need science to show us that cows get hurt when you hit them, for example. That's just cruel, and I think that science should just step back from those sorts of questions. But there is overlap and there is intersection. And so what is that intersection? So I think the overlap between science and animal law occurs around two areas. One, when we're considering the moral status of a species that's currently outside of or uncertainly in our sphere of moral concern. So these are animals that we might not think of as fully sentient. And then the second case would be non-consensus cases of potential cruelty. So when there's some sort of ambiguity about what a good, decent, just, or fair life would look like, and cruelties of omission and neglect. So you're not actually physically doing any harm directly, but by not doing something, you are indirectly potentially causing suffering and harm. So just to make this a little bit more concrete, if we think about some animals that we clearly think deserve some moral consideration versus apple trees. They're in animal agriculture, or they're in agriculture in general. There's going to be physical restriction, reproductive control, invasive procedures, altered life histories, premature death. All of these things might be of concern in and of themselves, and if you add on top of that unnecessary cruelty, we would only be considered about the animals that are currently within our sphere of moral concern and would not be worried about these things happening to plants. And science, I would argue, doesn't have much of a role to play here. But we're now farming lots and lots of different species. This is a sea cucumber. It's an animal. It's one of the animals that's being farmed at really high levels and being subjective to all of these things. And I think it might be unclear the extent to which we should be considering sea cucumber moral status. And so a little bit closer to home, and something that people are more currently actively engaged in thinking about, would be the moral status of fish, for example. And then on the converse, animals that we do think of as having really, lives that we should take seriously, but then questions about how we should treat them. What sort of extent of life do we need to provide them? And so we want to understand essentially the potential fullness of the life so that we can gauge the harm that's being done to these animals. So, with these questions about moral status and potential cases of cruelty, this is all surrounding subjectivity, subjective experience of individual animals. We're asking questions about whether the individual animal can feel and or desire autonomy and have a meaningful life and an engaging life, and then whether or not she does feel sufficient autonomy and meaning and engagement under current management practices. So I think those are the two core questions that we're interested in, to be able to gauge whether or not an animal is sentient enough to worry about, and whether or not the cases of neglect are reaching the level of, imposing cruelty or suffering on the animals. So we really want to know at this intersection about the subjectivity and the subjective experience of animals. And when we turn to science, one of the first places that we look is animal cognition. And there is a lot of great work in animal cognition that supports various sorts of arguments that you'd want to make along these lines. But thinking back to Mary Midgley, where are they coming from? What's the sort of basis of the foundation of this field? And both animal cognition and ethology, which is the behavioral study of wild animals, have basic science concerns. And in that history of science and the genesis of both of these fields, there has been explicit arguments against the ability to talk about subjective states in animals, how they feel, what they think, what they prefer, what their emotions are. All of those we have prominent scientists in both animal cognition and ethology saying those are things that are not acceptable, and they train graduate students that we cannot talk about those things. Science cannot address these things. So there's a basic bias that is built into the science to not address these questions. And beyond that, the framework is really mostly about understanding humans. So if we do cognitive tests, they're mostly about, well, humans can do this complicated mathematical thing. Can a chimpanzee do it? It's not from the framework of what a chimpanzee might think about the world, or it's a framework about evolution of genes, so a very reductive approach. The second place that we might look would be animal welfare. And animal welfare does have a history of talking about subjective states and taking subjective states seriously, but they're coming from a perspective where the systems of use and abuse are treated as standard or control conditions. So think about that. We have these factory farming, industrialized agriculture, laboratories. Those conditions are called standard. Those are the baseline. Those are what the reference point is. And there's little or no opportunity to explore more autonomous or meaningful lives. So beyond these fields in science that have a hard time dealing with subjective states, which would be the most helpful thing, I think, at the intersection of animal science and law, they both actively undermine the autonomy and meaningfulness in animal lives. Either because they find that that is not something that's acceptable in polite conversation to talk about in animal cognition and ethology, or because the framework doesn't even allow for the animals to have any kind of meaning or autonomy in their own lives. And so again, this is not to say that the work isn't out there. There is lots of great work. It's just that it doesn't have a natural home, and I think that it should be consumed by people outside of science as understanding that these are floor estimates of what's possible. These are floor estimates of how autonomous animals can be, how much meaning they can find in their lives, how individuated they are. And if you find it through these sciences, then that's great, and it does exist, but it's a floor estimate of what's possible. And instead, what I think is we need encouragement for having a devoted science to animal law. And I would propose something like animal protection science, with the idea that animal protection is a broad umbrella that encompasses animal welfare, animal rights, and psychological science. And it would put the whole animal, their physical and mental states first, to enhance our appreciation of animals' moral standing and broaden our own understanding of how our activities impact and constrain animal life. So, with the rest of this talk, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the work that I've done with my colleagues trying to bring this sort of perspective to the work that we're doing with fish. And the reason that, there's lots of reasons that I'm working with fish. It happens to be that I just love fish, and I've always loved fish, but there are now actual external reasons to be studying fish. So fish are now the most used laboratory animal. They're hunted in the wild at a scope and a range that is just beyond anything comparable to anything else that we're doing. We're in the trillions every year with the fish that we're hunting in the wild. They're also now being farmed at higher rates in total than all of land animals combined. So numerically, it's just way outpacing our activities on land at this point. There are, of course, also in public aquariums and zoos, and of course also in botanic gardens, there's lots of fish. And now there's actually more individual fish kept in private homes than there are dogs and cats combined. So there's a huge numerical problem here with our relationship with fish. And as that's changed, we've also come to understand that fish are actually incredibly interesting creatures that live fascinating lives. And I just have a selection here of a few of my favorites. Is there a pointer on here? I don't think so. Okay, so in the bottom center, there's the giant manta ray. This is my favorite because so fish are generally sort of denigrated as being primitive or inferior to us. That's sort of like the lay perspective that we're bringing to the table thanks to Aristotle. He put fish at the bottom of the animal scale. Anyway, so we have sort of this bias against fish. And then rays are cartilaginous fishes. They're not even bony fishes, though they're even more primitive and more denigrated compared to the other fish. Anyway, so we have these gorgeous giant manta rays, and there was a study that came out a couple years ago that showed that they can recognize themselves in the mirror, which is the criteria for self-awareness. Some monkeys don't even pass this test, and to watch these rays and the way they interacted with the mirror was absolutely gorgeous and stunning, and I just think they're just look at them, they're just like somebody make that up, it's like magic. Okay, so I love rays, so we'll start there. Then we have, to the left of the ray, we have a tusk fish using a tool. So now there's many species of fish that have been documented tool using, which, as you might know, when Jane Goodall discovered tool use in chimpanzees, people thought maybe we'd have to redefine mankind because that was our definition, but now fish are doing it as well. Let's see, archer fish, here they can recognize humans as individuals. So we're not looking at them as individuals, but they recognize us as individuals. Sea bass learn from each other, which sets the stage for cultural transmission of knowledge, and lots of fish can do that now. The cleaner wrasse are kind of the stars of the show. They're the little ones, and they go into the mouths and gills of big fish to clean out the parasites, and they're just absolutely fascinating. And they do all kinds of incredible things, including reconciliation, which is thought to be the foundation of morality. And then at the bottom here, we have the pufferfish. This little guy, you can't even really see him. He's the black smudge at the center there. He's very tiny, has made this elaborate nest off the coast of Japan. And when people first found it, there was some speculation that aliens had done this, but it was a pufferfish. Anyway, so at the same time that we're using fish, we're also realizing that they're living these amazing lives. And some of the reason that we're realizing that is coming from good science that's being done. The species that I work with are zebrafish, and so they typically would live in sort of something similar to this. They're little tiny carps. They look a little bit like guppies, and the fast-flowing rivers, streams, and pools. So, if you might want to think about finding out more about zebrafish and you turn to science, this is where zebrafish live in the laboratory, barren environments, high stocking density, essentially a completely monotonous life. And now they're one of the most studied animals on the planet. There's more research being done on zebrafish than mice at this point. They're used in toxicology studies, they're used in developmental studies, they're used in genetics and neuroscience, et cetera, et cetera. So as they started getting used more and more, people started wondering about their welfare. And one of the first papers that came out about their welfare was, does structural enrichment for toxicology studies improve zebrafish welfare? And the conclusion of this study was basically no. These results indicate that the addition of glass rod structures as hypothesized enrichment did not result in a measurement improvement of welfare. And this study, basically, if you think about it, you have these zebrafish living in these barren tanks. The scientists put in some glass rods, and the zebrafish didn't like it, and all of a sudden zebrafish don't like enrichment. And it sounds crazy, but basically what's happening is the scientists are bringing their values to the table. They're toxicologists. They need things in that tank that can be cleaned and are inert and whatever. They have that certain constraint that they're bringing to the table, but it's generating a certain kind of impression, and I can't tell you how many times people have told me that zebrafish don't like enrichment. And obviously I cannot be sure, but it's likely that it's traced back to this paper. It got cited a lot, so this notion that they don't like enrichment. And now there's been good work to show that that's definitely not the case. They just don't like glass rods, but I wouldn't want glass rods in my office either, so. Anyway, so I wanted to say, okay, I'm just going to take it for granted that they want to live in an environment that looks at least reasonably similar to their natural environment. And my question was, what else might be missing? Do they want cognitive stimulation? Do they want to learn? Do they want chances to explore? So that was my baseline. So I was housing them like this. This is some information about them. And I want to just show you their baseline behavior in these tanks. So basically, they sort of were spread out, doing these little chases and charges to maintain their distances. In ethology, we call that agonism. It's not full-blown aggression. It's just sort of a little like, just leave me alone. But they're basically doing this at any given time. But then we saw this other behavior, and I turned to the scientific literature to try to understand what this was that we were seeing, and I found nothing even coming close to describing what we're seeing. And so I'll show you a video of what that looks like. And even without behavioral training, I hope you can see that this is very distinct behavior. This is not just on some sort of continuum. They're doing something else here. And the more we looked at it, the more we thought, this looks like really calm and peaceful and maybe positive. And I wonder, how the fish are feeling when they're doing this. And like I said, there was nothing in the scientific literature about it. So we published this paper, Is Heightened Shoaling a Good Candidate for Positive Emotional Behavior? And we wanted to document the behavior and evaluate its characteristics, especially with regards to whether or not there was a positive versus negative subjective experience. And for sake of time, I'm just going to fly through the results, but basically we took scan sampling where we drilled in deep to understand the particular characteristics of the behavior, and then all occurrence sampling where we just looked at how often it occurred. And if we look at fish locations, and we compared it to a baseline and pre-feed time, if we look at fish locations, the heightened shoaling, they were very clumped together. As you could see from that video, we were able to quantify that. And you can see on the bottom right there that basically the interfish distances, they were very, very, very close together in a way that they never were during baseline. There was also some synchrony going on. I don't have time to explain. And also the agonism dropped dramatically to just a third of its normal levels. This behavior lasted on average for 7 minutes, but sometimes it lasted for 30 minutes. So it's a protracted, long duration behavior. It occurred all times during the day, and it rarely occurred at the same time in 2 tanks, which suggests that it wasn't some room level event that was then the fish were responding to. Rather, it was driven by internal group dynamics. So we found no signs of negative affect. Zebrafish dropped to the bottom when that happens. They weren't dropping to the bottom. They were synchronized. It was spontaneous, driven by internal group dynamics. There was high participation rates, and it was protracted and self-reinforcing. So these are all hallmarks of positive emotional behavior, and we're seeing it in the zebrafish, and it's never been documented in the scientific literature in one of the most studied species on the planet. And I, came along with a shoestring budget and a bunch of amazing collaborators and undergraduate research assistants, and I was able to make this fundamental discovery about something about the positive lives of these fish. Was it because they're not doing it in these other tanks? Was it because nobody noticed? I think either way it doesn't matter. The right questions are not being asked for the purposes of actually understanding the zebrafish. So we're also working on this project called Do Fish Have Fun? I unfortunately don't have time to talk about it, but the answer is basically yes. They do lots and lots of different fish. We found evidence on YouTube that they engage in play behaviors across all different families of fish. So again, there's evidence out there for animals living these really amazing lives. So in conclusion, I want to end with a quote from Gay Bradshaw, who wrote Elephants on the Edge. And she wrote about how considering individual animals who are studied in scientific research underscores the pressing need to realign ethics and practice with current knowledge, to create research that is directed and shaped by other animals' needs. The minds and hearts of other animals must be understood from their own points of view, not from enforced anthropocentric standards based on exploitation and domination. And so with that, I'd like to thank some of my excellent colleagues and funding and institutional support. And you all very much, thank you for listening.
Okay, so hi, Priscilla, thanks so much for that introduction. I'm so glad to hear about the fox and the logo, it's great. And my book on Pearson and Post, I actually dedicated to the fox. And people who don't know me from my animal law life, who just know me from my legal history life, they think I'm joking, but I really did mean that. Yeah, and that book was actually really the way that I got into this field, because I started realizing after years of working on it that I was using the fox too, and started feeling bad about that, and it made me reflect and so on. So it's sort of been part of the process. But thanks for that. Okay, so like philosophy and science, law has cemented and facilitated the use and abuse of non-human animals by providing a framework for their exploitation. So essentially codifying the speciesist or anthropocentric biases humans have about the superiority of their own species, which for the most part the law is mirroring. The law's mirroring function is both a source of frustration and promise. Frustration, because it's so difficult to get ahead of what most people want to be able to continue to do, use animals subject to restrictions on gross or sadistic treatment, which even in certain circumstances is authorized, as in scientific research and in industrial agriculture. But this mirroring function is also promising because the law is powerful, and it can help lead or at least encourage social change. Until people really want to change, one has the feeling the law can only do so much, but there are promising points, and I've been asked to provide an overview of some of these in this talk. The inheritance here, the history is powerful and it's very negative. Western European law, as opposed to, say, indigenous legal traditions, uses the Roman law distinction between property and persons. So as Joyce mentioned at the outset, placing humans and a few other entities on the person side and non-human animals all on the property side. So Steve Wise calls this the Great Wall. Animal lawyers have been working with these categories for decades, trying to push non-human animals away from property and further toward persons. The strategies for doing this are roughly four. Emphasizing intelligence, the intelligence of non-human animals. So here by focusing on non-human animals with demonstrated high cognitive capacities, such as chimpanzees, elephants, and orcas. Secondly, by emphasizing sentience, the capacity for pain and pleasure, which make it clear that non-human animals are importantly different from other forms of property. Thirdly, emphasizing dignity, that non-human animals have lives with inherent worth that matter to them. And then fourthly, personhood, that non-human animals have rights that create around them a zone of non-interference that is analogous to, if different from, human rights. Their interests, their rights, their suffering, and the quality of their lives matter. Different legal campaigns, as many of you know, combine these strategies. So Steve Wise's Non-Human Rights Project, for example, uses a combination of intelligence and personhood. So he's arguing for the recognition of legal personhood in the form of habeas corpus relief for imprisoned individual animals of some of the most intelligent species, elephants, or chimpanzees first and now elephants, or at least we should probably say the ones whose intelligence is most like ours. His group, they're trying to pull along judges who are generally resistant to seeing personhood as a legal, but also a moral, social, and political category as opposed to a biological one. Building explicitly or not on Peter Singer's original emphasis in animal liberation, which we got that great introduction to, sentience is becoming more and more popular legislatively. And here I would recommend to people who are interested in following up on this, Charlotte Blattner has published a piece in the most recent issue of the Journal of Animal Ethics, where she surveys jurisdictions globally on the use of sentience. And then dignity for animals is a concept that can be included in a legal document as important as the Constitution, as for instance Switzerland does. And I think we can clearly say that the legislative and especially constitutional expressions here, they can both lead societal views and also follow, or what I've been calling mirroring. And the way that we normally talk about this in laws, we say that law and society are mutually constitutive. It's just to say each one is influencing the other, and it's often difficult to say which one's coming first. And you know, in this company, it's probably not a great metaphor, but to say it's like a chicken and an egg problem. I'm not really sure which one's coming first. But with animals, I think probably everyone agrees that the law can, it's really working with what people are thinking, and it's very difficult to just sort of come in and do something that people are completely resistant to. It's probably also fair to say that the expressions, such as legislative ones and constitutional ones, they can certainly be empty words, to quote Greta Thunberg. They are aspirational, though, and when they're genuine, they're trying to get people to start thinking about animals this way, as more than mere property. And so that's sort of the kind of the theme, is that we want to get people to be thinking of this first, that they're more than mere property. I think it's important to note that all four of these approaches are based on a like-us form of reasoning, that animals deserve protection, liberation, freedom to live their own lives just like we do. The focus on intelligence does this most explicitly, but I think the other approaches also do it. So we're saying they feel pain and pleasure like us. They deserve dignity in the way that humans do, in the way that fits how they live or would like to live their lives. They are persons in the sense of having interests that deserve legal protection as ours do, even if they are different given who they are, what they care about, and how they want to live. Now, that's not to say that the anthropocentrism makes these approaches good or bad, but it's just to note that they're sharing that structure. And I actually think it's quite difficult to imagine a legal construction or argument that wouldn't be anthropocentric just because of how anthropocentric law is. A fact here that is a little bit confusing, or maybe also perhaps promising, is that the law is already recognizing at least some of these features. So anti-cruelty statutes, they have been recognizing animal rights in the sense of having interests that deserve to be protected since the 19th century. These statutes arguably implicitly recognize sentience as well, because there would be no reason to prohibit being unnecessarily cruel if you don't think the animal can feel anything. And that's part of what Charlotte talks about in her piece, as well as the sort of the implicit recognitions of sentience as well as the explicit ones. Now, we know that these statutes are widely viewed as inadequate, and so one might reasonably ask whether the ideas animating them are also inadequate. However, I think that these kinds of concessions, that animals already have rights, the law already recognizes their sentience, these are promising because they open up space for arguing that the law already recognizes that they are not just property. Their sentience precludes them from being treated in this way. Some rights mean some personhood. If this is true, we should figure out how to stop falling back on the old Roman law distinction between property and persons. And the way I have started to think about this is that the property-persons dichotomy or binary is a bit like a trap. It makes a cage that we can't get ourselves out of. And I was speaking to John Lavorne a few weeks ago when I was visiting Yale, talking about some of the Pearson work, actually, the book. He said this to me in conversation, and I thought, yeah, this sounds absolutely right to me, that it traps us. And so part of what I'm trying to do is think about how we can get out of that. There's a lot of very rich literature now on Indigenous conceptions of animals as persons, and because I'm Canadian, I'm from Canada, we've been engaged in this process called the Truth and Reconciliation for some time now, and animal law in Canada is sort of being brought into that to some extent as well. So there's some very rich ideas here, conceptions of animals as persons, that they are inspirited, that right relations with them requires respect for their inherent worth. Different species are different nations. They are relations, and different kin, sort of like the Pythagorean idea, actually. And so lumping them all together the way we do in colonial humanism with animal versus human non-animal, this washes out enormous differences between species. So it's talking about fish versus land animals, or even looking within fish. And Becca and I were talking last night about how many species of fish it is. It's incredible. And so this is going to be difficult if we're just going to use these very huge categories. There's also ideas here about non-human animals being powerful and not weak. And I think that's an important point Tammy Bryant has made, looking at whether this focus on sentience might be a little bit, got a problem with it, because is sentience really going to make people feel, is it going to get the empathy that you want, or is sentience going to have a counterproductive effect? But this idea that that animals can be seen as powerful, that could be very helpful. And also this idea that when they're living, they're not property. So, in the common law, we say, well, animals are either wild, and they're subject to the capture rule. This is the rule that Pearson and Post sets out, or they're domestic. And if they're domestic, they're absolutely owned, but if they're wild, they're owned in a qualified way, quote unquote. This wild domestic distinction also creates problems for us. And I'm going to give an example in a moment about this in relationship to farm fish. But for those who do not like where Western humanism and Western Roman law-based ideas take us, there are ideas here in terms of our resistance to a binary that I think is unhelpful and is actually legally inaccurate. I have suggested here using the idea of quasi-property, quasi-person, to suggest that there are elements of both property and personhood in how we relate to non-human animals, and that there's room with this concept to grow into how we should relate to them. So I've published a piece in this recently in the Canadian Journal of Contemporary and Comparative Law, and I think the conference has put it on the background readings for this panel. If anyone would like to take a look, I would be interested to hear from you what you think. We've used this idea in the Amici brief for Justice the Horse, who you heard a little bit about last night, the Painting for Justice, and then later this afternoon there's going to be a panel. Matthew Lieberman from the ADLF is going to talk about that case. You're going to hear more about it. But myself, Kathy Hessler here at Lewis and Clark, and Justin Marceau, we led a group of academics into writing about this idea that we want to move away from more than mere property, kind of bringing together instances or examples where this is already happening, and also using the quasi idea to talk about this. I gave it to my students in my animal law class to read, and they had to do comment papers, and I was reading the comment papers on the way here on the plane. And one of my students, instead of looking at quasi-property, quasi-person, he said, well, what could we just say, quasi-hood? And I thought, oh yeah, maybe that's better. That could be like a shorter way, a compendious way of referring to this. So I'm going to take that suggestion. But I think abolitionists, and traditionally, and I'm sure many people in the room are sort of would consider themselves to be in this camp. For abolitionists, a kind of a quasi idea of quasi-hood. This will seem maybe too status quo or too apologetic. So you think, if they already have this, is it really getting us anywhere? But the idea here is to try to get the concession that non-human animals are more than property. They already have rights, and they already are, which makes them already persons in a way, and to try to get this into our language, the way that we're talking and the way that we're thinking. Because language, I believe, like law, can also lead and mirror. So if you can do some leading with the language, and that is actually mirroring, arguably, what the situation is, then that could sort of, affect those deep structures. When people say, oh, well, the categories we think with are very important. I think in this area, that would probably be true. And I do feel that repeating their property, as many people do, someone like Gary Francione, for instance, will take that approach. That this has got a problem with it because it's missing the sort of the positive, and maybe reifying and cementing this idea that they are. And I think that that's counterproductive if you're trying to work to change that. So I'm using this opportunity to share the idea with you and to hear what you think. I wanted to just end with an example of farm fish. How much time do I have here? I got 5, perfect, okay. So here, for farmed fish, they are a good example, I think, of the difference that using this quasi-idea could make. Because if we look at farm fish, using the common law, we sort of have, these two categories we can use. We can either call them wild or we can call them domestic. I think a company who's producing them is going to want to say that they're domestic, that they're owned in an absolute way, and perhaps they've invested in engineering them in some way that makes them less aggressive, or that makes them, fatter, or maybe even genetically altered them. They certainly have invested in their eggs and raising them and feeding them and so on. But what happens when these fish escape? And we've had now in Canada 2 instances of this in just the last 2 months. So in New Brunswick, 1,000 salmon escaped from a fish farm in New Brunswick. And there, some of the media coverage was talking about this idea, once they escape, potentially the company can say that they're not ours because they're wild and they've returned to the wild. And they would then again be subject to the capture rule, right? So unless you're actually holding them, they're no longer yours. But the problem with that is that, we're not wild. I mean, they didn't come from there. And if you sort of imagine them, instead of being Atlantic salmon, being Pacific salmon that are being farmed on the in Atlantic waters, or even if they're the Atlantic ones, they're not the same as the wild population if they've been altered in some way and they threaten the wild population. And the company is arguably liable for their fish. Okay, so I give this example to show that, if you were just going to abolish the property status of the fish, would you not then also be affecting the company's potential liability for their fish and damage that they might do to the wild population, or even just the reporting requirements, because this is sort of the issue that we're dealing with. The New Brunswick case, the company came out and said these fish have escaped. There was 1,000 of them. There was an incident in Newfoundland, which I'm not sure how much American press coverage this got, but in Newfoundland, that incident is actually a huge environmental disaster. The numbers that are now being reported of farmed salmon that have died, it's 2.6 million. The company originally didn't really report, and then when the New Brunswick company did 4,000 fish, I think they thought, we've got over 1 million fish here that we're going to have to do this. And then the cleanup just became, they couldn't have not reported it. It's been a really, really big, an obvious problem cleaning it up. And what happened to these fish, so it's the environmental disaster that people are mostly talking about, I would say, in the news. But this incident also raises enormous welfare concerns. So these fish, they were seeking cooler waters because the water temperatures were warmer than normal, and because of that they swam deeper, and then the fish that were closer to the surface of the water died and fell on them and crushed them and would have slowly suffocated them. So this is one of these, it's a horrible death. By any welfare standard, and I think it's engaging a little bit with what Becca was talking about in terms of numbers. It's just really, really hard for us to get our minds around this, and the idea that it's the warm waters were completely to blame. There's going to be an investigation, but it looks like it's also probably overcrowding, because originally the government said, it couldn't be more than 2 million fish because the pens can only hold 2 million fish. Well, the count is 2.6, so there was clearly overcrowding, we're going to have to figure out what to do about this. Given that fish are not generally included in welfare protections, because of this bias I think we have about land animals and aquatic animals, or at least non-charismatic marine animals, this is an issue. So we wouldn't want to have a total conception of property here, that the company says, there are fish, we can do what we want with them. If we overcrowd them and they die, and 2.6 million of them die, then that's just our business. But we do want to have a sense that I think that if those fish escape, they're still your fish and you're still responsible for them. And a kind of a quasi idea for property might help with that. Similarly, a quasi idea for personhood could help with understanding that they have some interests. And whenever we talk in law about the entities having interests that are analogous to rights and that they already have rights in some sense, people want to know, well, what are those interests? Well, I would say in an example like this, you have a minimal interest in not having a horrible death, like that death that those 2.6 million fish suffered, that surely we could agree that whatever else rights encompasses, it would apply to that. Now, you don't need the idea of property for responsibility or for animal welfare, but it is very powerful. This idea that they're your fish, you have to take care of them responsibly. If there's an accident, there's escape, there's disaster, you got to report it, you got to clean it up, and you could lose your license. And in fact, in Newfoundland, that company has had its license suspended. Property here could be a quasi notion of property, though, and also for persons, a quasi notion of persons. Just to say something about quasi here, the idea is, well, you're sort of saying something is similar but not the same as, so there's a recognition of a similarity but also a difference. And because in law we have all kinds of quasi-criminal, quasi sort of constitutional and so on ideas, that it wouldn't be such a foreign idea for lawyers. Okay, thanks so much, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
All right, we will now take some questions. Please line up on the microphones at each side.
Are we all set?
You're all set.
Can you guys hear me?
We can hear you.
Hi, I am Diana Urban. I recently retired from the Connecticut legislature after 18 years, after passing a bill called Desmond's Law, and I did retire to bring Desmond's Law national. What Desmond's Law does, and it's probably the first law in the country, it puts an attorney in court to represent the interests of a dog or a cat in cases of egregious abuse. To date, we have done 60 cases with attorneys in court in Connecticut. Maine just passed the bill on their legislature. It's waiting for the governor's signature. Here's my question. It has also been introduced in about 6 other states that we're working on. In Connecticut, one of my main opposition was the Veterinary Medical Association and the American Kennel Club. And I mean, when I say main opposition, you guys, I mean opposition. In my other life, I'm an economics professor, so I try to use all my academic knowledge to refute the arguments that were absurd. It was about getting between the interests of the animal and the interests of the animal's owner. I thought that because we battled this in Connecticut, that it was under control and that they would back off. But let me tell you, I'm working in Illinois right now. The Veterinary Medical Association in Illinois has done a statewide opposition to this law. So my question for you guys is, what do we do? Where do we go to say that we are not interfering with the interests of the owner and the animal when we are talking about a pit bull that has been stabbed 27 times? Or we're talking about a cat that has been put in the microwave? Or we're talking about somebody that's taken a kitten and slammed it against the wall? I thought that in Connecticut, because I fought this, it took 3 sessions to get this bill done. And those of you who are legislators, you can just imagine the deals I had to make. But I thought we were done. And now I find this statewide to each and every veterinarian. You better be sure that you make sure that this bill does not come to fruition in the state of Illinois. I would appreciate any and all guidance. And I would like to thank all of you. Your presentations were amazing, and it's wonderful to be here with people that think similarly. So I look forward, and I'm going to sit down because I get tired holding myself up.
Anyone want to?
I think I would just say, I mean, I just, that must be so frustrating, and I can just feel that. And, and I think the example just really shows how powerful and how strong that property conception is, right? Like, it's mine, I can do what I want, and it doesn't matter. It would be interesting to think about, if we're going to try to use some of these, like, language, to change our language to sort of lead and then to help people move away. If the idea of guardianship for pets, I mean, I think people talked about that a lot, and in some places how that could mitigate and sort of help a bit. But obviously, it's difficult because you're going to be outweighed by these other interests, and it's frustrating. But I mean, I think just keep going. Yeah.
Any other questions? Step right up.
So I'll pitch this to everyone on the panel. If we decide that the thing that is required, or a important factor for moral consideration, is sentience, and if we stipulate that sentience is more than just a stimulus response to external physical factors, is there a better way to identify a marker of sentience than, say, the presence of an internal system that can process and respond to opiates or other natural painkillers? Is there a better scientific marker for sentience that we can point to, or is that our current best practice?
What was the best practice that you were referring to?
Well, there are arguments that have been made that if we assume that sentience is the ability to experience and respond to pain, so more than just, for example, touch or sensation, there are arguments that if you've got a system that can respond to painkillers, natural opiates, clearly you're sentient because you can experience pain.
Yeah, okay, so
I'm wondering, is there more?
Yeah, your criteria would be, your gold standard would be, do you have a nervous system that looks like a human nervous system? Okay. First of all, I think this conversation about is sentience even the right thing to be talking about is a valid one. But if we are going to talk about sentience, we are. So then, number two, sentience is not just pain. It's also the ability to experience pleasure, and it's also, I think more critically than pain, it's suffering, which can be depression, it can be anxiety, it can be repeated fear. So it's not just about pain, it's gotten hijacked by pain, especially when we're talking about fish. But since we're talking about pain, if we recognize that we have a certain kind of nervous system to respond to pain, there's other animals on this planet that don't have our nervous system. And if we use our own nervous system as the criteria, there's a whole bunch of animals that are not going to be included. The question is whether or not we should be using our nervous system as the criteria for whether or not that is the proper standard for understanding whether or not an animal can experience pain. And the idea being that you could have a reflexive response like you do at the doctor, where your knee jerks up but you didn't consciously do that, or that you could maybe pull your hand away from a hot stove without actually experiencing any sort of felt subjective sense of pain. So there's parts of the human nervous system that are responsible for that don't exist in fish. And so the argument has been that because the fish don't have these parts of nervous system, and when people don't have that part of their brain intact, they don't feel pain, therefore fish can't feel pain. This is a completely flawed argument. There is no sense this is the difference between function and structure. We have certain structures that provide certain functions in our lives. A good example of this is sharks look very similar in profile to dolphins because that function of getting through the water in a certain kind of way is served very well by this particular structure. It's, you can get to the same place with different sorts of structures that aren't necessarily exactly the same in their molecular makeup. So I think that the argument about structure, when we're actually talking about function, we're actually talking about does the animal feel pain, is going to lead us astray over and over and over again. And I know we're trying to wrap up, but this is such an important point, if I may. Another way to think about this is with octopus. Octopus You all have seen the amazing things that they can do and the way they move through the world. Octopus, the last common ancestor with us, was a microscopic worm that did not have eyes and did not have a neocortex, a visual cortex. If a human being does not have eyes or a visual cortex, either one, if you knock out somebody's visual cortex or you take away their eyes, we can't see. Does that mean, and octopus certainly don't have a visual cortex or eyes because they are on a completely different evolutionary path. They have evolved something that serves the same function as seeing, both in terms of the things that are on their head, but if you have an anatomical definition of eyeballs, they actually don't have eyeballs, and they don't have a visual cortex. So we're going to say that octopus can't see? It makes zero sense. Of course they can see. So there's certain things in the world that serve functions that are helpful for animals in their life and managing their life, and pain is certainly one of them. And there's different ways to get to that place, and it doesn't have to just be the human version. And by the way, birds don't have the parts of the brain that it can experience pain either. So if we're going to make this argument for fish, we also have to make the argument for birds, and I think it's totally unfair. Sorry.
Thank you, that was delightful.